Thank you so much, Grace. I'm absolutely honored to be part of the Sunstone Symposium this year. You know, my submission to be part of this symposium coincided with my request to resign my membership from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I faxed my request on my 67th birthday, the 1st of April. I received word from Sunstone on May 20th that I would participate in the conference this year. The corporation notified me on May 25th that they had received my request and that they had removed my membership. What a birthday gift. Why did I choose my birthday to request my resignation? I now have begun a rebirth, a new life. For many years prior, my life seemed to be swirling inside a tornado of contradictions and dissonance. I have taken the last year to follow a path of enlightenment and discovered my worth, my purpose, and that a false narrative had been guiding my values. Very good men, but bad wizards had controlled the structure of my life. The teachings of my church had distorted my vision of Christ's teachings with magic glasses and an idealized script. I have witnessed the priesthood, which I have been taught was the power to serve and bless others, but only experienced this by women. The male version of this power to act in God's name was used to dominate, silence, posture, and condemn. When I became the mother of a severely disabled child, this was made glaringly clear. I took off my magic glasses. I couldn't believe I had been lied to. I had been set up to support a system that was based on lies, power, and greed. My marriage in the Salt Lake Temple to my returned missionary followed the script of a perfect marketing movie President Hinckley would have been proud of. He did ironically marry us in the Salt Lake Temple. Clapboard, scene 1. For the first 11 years of our marriage, we followed the script to a T. Two white young people working in an era that still tolerated large families. Being a blue-collar worker and a member of a union usually meant good pay and medical insurance. A few days after celebrating our anniversary of 11 years, our 6th child was born. My paradigm shift was delivered to me in the form of a 6-pound baby boy lying in a plexiglass incubator. His body was beautiful and perfect on the outside. It was malformed and not functioning on the inside. It took me 35 years to discover I too had been lying in a Truman Show-like incubator. It was also humidified, filtered, and entirely staged. His birth introduced a plethora of doctors into my life: pulmonary specialists, neurologists, pediatricians, anesthesiologists, and family practitioners and orthopedic surgeons. Adding to this were physical therapists and occupational therapists. Unfortunately, I can only count a few that improved my baby's life, and to whom I am grateful for. The first two are the surgeons who happen to be at Oregon Health and Science University and specialized in diaphragmatic hernias. Number 3 is the pediatric gastroenterologist who patiently talked me into a feeding tube for our son. The fourth is a Christ-like pain specialist who convinced me that an internal baclofen pump would improve the quality of my severely spastic son's life. I'm afraid many of the other doctors offered little nuanced help, treated us like a number, often rattling off advice that had nothing to do with my son's condition. Medical assistants mindlessly handed me milestone charts as they led me into the examination room. Thanks for reminding me my baby should be sitting up and rolling over, but by the way, he can't smile or swallow. Doctors number 5 and 6 are Dr. Gregory Prince and Dr. John DeLynn. Dr. Prince was John's first guest on his podcast and one of the first I watched. Dr. Prince was speaking about his new book, The Biography of David O. McKay. I was intimidated by the size of the book, but once opened, I couldn't put it down. Then I read Gay Rights and the Mormon Church After that, I watched his presentations on YouTube and listened to him on podcasts. I heard him speak of his son with autism, and I hope to listen to his wife someday share her journey with a disabled son. We joined the church during the Camelot years of President McKay, so I was witness to many of Dr. Prince's reflections. After Dr. Prince, I read A House Full of Females. I was off. What drove me to this search for happiness? Patriarchy, exhaustion, and a search for understanding. I heard Dr. Prince once refer to being outside the Zion's curtain. I was raised outside the curtain growing up in Illinois. If you haven't already guessed, I love movies, and my favorite is The Wizard of Oz. My love for the magic of witchcraft germinated with watching The Wizard of Oz on TV as a child. The movie first played on TV on November 3rd, 1956. Watching this was an annual event, and all things came to a halt the night of the viewing. This American fairy tale unconsciously set a standard for me. Frank Baum's wife in real life was a strong, independent woman, and that was how he portrayed his female dominant characters. I watched Auntie Em working beside her husband on the farm, and she was in charge of those 3 farmhands. There was no patriarchy in Kansas. Dorothy courageously dealt with her problems. The lion, scarecrow, and the tin man needed Dorothy as much as she needed them. Quoting Richard Rohr, quote, "Like the Christ mystery itself, the deep feminine often works underground and in the shadows, and from that position creates a much more intoxicating message. While church and culture have repeatedly denied the divine feminine roles, offices, and formal authority, the feminine has continued to exercise incredible power at the cosmic and personal levels. Feminine power is profoundly relational and symbolic, and thus transformative in ways that men cannot control or even understand. I suspect that is why we fear it so much." Close quote. My childhood was as golden as the yellow brick road. I was a free-range child, as most were in the 50s and 60s. I found treasures by the railroad tracks and sat quietly under the green roof of giant oak trees, remarkably similar to the forest in The Wizard of Oz. Jumping grasshoppers, lightning bugs, ice cream trucks, and cousins comprised the cast and staging of my childhood. My experiences as a child with only Jesus references formed me, gave me stability, a sense of belonging and value. My childhood gave me the worth and the courage to stand here this morning. I love the wisdom of Brené Brown. One of her awakening quotes is, quote, "Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of light." Close quote. On May 25th, I became brave. Glennon Doyle reminds us that, quote, "When a woman finally learns that pleasing the world is impossible, she becomes free to learn how to please herself." Close quote. I have permitted myself to please myself and to use my brain. The practicing physician who performed my cesarean birth in a small town 45 minutes south of Chicago was the kind of hometown doctor who carried a black medical bag and made house calls. He delivered babies and cared for Grandpa. My grandmother saved my life. Lydia Mae Regan came to the hospital after my birth and was shocked at my appearance. I was yellow. This strong matriarch, in actual terms of endearment fashion, demanded that the staff alert the doctor. Maybe this is where I inherited the trait of questioning medical authority. Science didn't identify the Rh factor until the 1940s. Before this, over 100,000 babies died every year. Researchers developed a single injection that prevents this in the 60s. I was what they called an RH baby. The staff rushed me into surgery, performing a complete blood transfusion. Grandma lived in a tiny apartment with 2 bedrooms, 1 little bathroom, and a kitchen you could hardly turn in. Despite my aunts and uncles living in the homes much more accommodating, we gathered in this tiny apartment for holidays and events. Various potluck dishes complemented my grandmother's fried chicken. She made the best fried chicken in all of Illinois. After dinner, all the granddaughters cleared the table and chatted away in that tiny kitchen, washing and drying the dishes. My grandfather's bedroom hugged the sweet smell of his pipe tobacco and Old Spice. The dollhouse bathroom was pink with a clawfoot tub. Below their apartment stood my grandmother's office. She was the Grundy County Civil Defense Director. My olfactory memory for this vignette includes oak furniture, typewriter ink, and the smell of the old elevator that we took to get grounded. Post-World War II, anti-communism was the focus. It wasn't just tornadoes that we practiced sheltering for. Air raid drills were part of my schooling. Grandmother was a devout follower of Jesus, As the World Turns, and the Lawrence Welk Show. She followed each with the same devotion. She taught her 8 children to love Jesus. They all practiced some form of Protestantism. To give you a better idea of how outside the curtain we all existed, the first and only experience I've had of getting drunk was when I was 3. I had a jolly time toddling around at a family picnic and taking a sip of one unattended glass of beer to another. My family loved this story because I was taught Jesus loved me without qualifiers. My parents divorced when I was 7. My mother had had her eyes on her section manager at work. She worked her bell, book, and candle magic, bewitching this tall, dark, and handsome confirmed bachelor into 2 stepchildren and a mortgage. He was from Malvern, England, and spoke with that hypnotic accent. I loved and adored him as well. In 1966, 2 sister missionaries knocked on our door. It wasn't an easy conversion. These sisters worked hard to baptize my family. The bishop and his wife took my parents under their wing. They mesmerized them with family home evenings and dinner invitations. My parents learned a new language and catchy phrases such as, "Remember who you are." We were baptized and began our new form of life. My parents accepted callings. My stepfather served in the stake presidency with Dallin Oaks in Naperville, Illinois. The building was 45 minutes away from our home. My poor accountant stepfather watched the gas bills rise as I attended seminary daily. We traveled to church twice on Sundays, weekly MIA, primary and relief society. It just certified our holiness. Sacrifice equals exaltation. With our new superiority in place, and because we were members of the one and only true church, my mother began proselyting. Her siblings repeatedly asked her to stop. They finally had had enough and cut her off. It was now Mormons against the Methodists. All family gatherings came to a halt. Gone was the beautiful harmony of my mother and her sisters singing, "Tell me why the stars do shine. Tell me why this ivy twines. Tell me why the sky's so blue, and I will tell you just why I love you." Soon I lost my best friend, roommate, and protector, my big brother. The pressure to become a Mormon boy at 16 was too much, and he went to live with my biological father. My parents prepared to attend the temple after the required year. My brother and I needed written permission from our biological father to have the sealing ordinance done. sealing us to our stepfather. He had never officially adopted us. My mother waited in the car and sent her 12-year-old daughter and 15-year-old son into our Uncle Rich's home where we had tracked down our father. We presented the paperwork and asked for his signature. "So you think your father won't be your father after you die?" my Aunt Betty asked. I loved my aunt and uncle. I made my Uncle Rich promise to marry me when I was 3. We lived across the street from them before my parents divorced, and I spent as much time at their home as I did my own. I responded to my aunt's question as only an innocent child can. Yep. I didn't even understand what I was doing. I will give my mother credit for converting 1 sister and 1 brother. My grandmother joined after my grandfather died. Her activity lasted only long enough for her to go to the temple for her endowments. She and my grandfather were lifelong Masons. After attending the Oakland Temple, she vowed never to return, explaining it was just a replica of the Masonic ceremony. My life took a huge turn when my stepfather was transferred to the West Coast. I was moved from a large high school with all the extracurricular activities to a small country school. I couldn't wait to get out of there and start my own life. I joined the military when college was taken off the table because of finances. I made a commitment to begin my active duty in January, but had the summer to enjoy. I met my future husband at a church dance that summer. He already had his mission call. I already had a contract with the U.S. Navy, so we dated for 4 months. When my missionary's 2 years were almost over, I wrote him and told him that I could only take a 30-day leave. I hinted that we had 2 options: A, begin dating, or B, we could get married. He accepted my proposal, and I began planning a wedding from Yokosuka, Japan, where I was stationed. When you only have 30 days, things move fast. He was still acting in missionary mode when we married 3 weeks after his mission in the Salt Lake Temple. We went through a live session for my endowments on Wednesday, caught the movie in Provo on Thursday, and another full day on our official wedding day on Friday. Honestly, I loved the ritual. I didn't hear the actual covenants that I was making. I was excited with the secret and unique ceremony that I was privileged to be a part of. I grew up playing with the Ouija board and spooky stuff, and costumes were my thing. We arrived in Japan, and my husband was the first male dependent on base. The branch president made him one of his counselors at the age of 22. I was a new bride sitting alone in the pews, but so proud of my husband on the stand between 2 older men. I could never have imagined that him sitting on the stand and me sitting alone in the congregation would be the routine my entire married life. He went from assistant to his mission president to assistant to the branch president. He got a job driving taxi on base and would bring home strangers he had met in his cab. We finally had a little talk after the last scary couple he brought home to have dinner and convert. I had to remind him his mission was over, and please stop asking me to do companion prayers. I couldn't see that I had not only taken his name, but had been positioned in his shadow. My plans to begin our family and get an early discharge didn't work. After I had completed my contract with an honorable discharge in hand, we were on our way back to Oregon. The flight was unusually miserable. I was nauseous the whole time. Very strange for me, I'm rarely sick. I officially put on our oldest son's birth announcement, made in Japan. We began our married life in the late 70s, when, if and when you were out in the wild with your large family, strangers would simply approach with the question, "Are you Mormon or Catholic?" Often the store clerk would ask if all these children taking up space in my shopping cart were mine, as if nothing makes a shopping trip more fun than gathering up all the neighborhood children. My husband was working with his father 16 hours a day and serving in various leadership positions. I never felt alone except at church. Though my title was stay-at-home mom, I never stayed home. During the week, I picked up my babies and we explored the beautiful Pacific Northwest. In our first 11 years of marriage, there was rarely a time my husband did not serve in a calling that took him away from family. I was taking 5 children to church alone, sitting alone, returning home alone on Sunday. His career demanded 16-hour days, at least 5 days a week, usually 6. The church took the rest of his time. I'm an independent person and not afraid to venture out alone. I loved gathering my chicks and taking them to the zoo, the beach, the desert, the mountains. It was easier to keep the house clean. Comparatively, dressing and tending to 5 little people and silencing them for an hour was a chore. I would be welcoming them and all the other primary children ages 3 to 12 to primary, leading sharing time, helping our 3-year-old give a talk that we had worked on all week, and teaching a class when someone would not show up. It was exhausting and chaotic. My little 4-year-old once said, "Mommy, why are you so mean at home and then turn nice in primary?" He could already see the hypocrisy. I tightened my jaw when I spotted my husband in the hallway, chatting with a few other men as I dragged someone else's child to the bathroom. Would that have been considered conversing with the elders of Egypt? Baby number 6 was due December 23rd. My babies always came earlier than their due dates. My water broke on December 5th. I was confident in my body's ability to endure natural childbirth and produce healthy babies. That was my proven paradigm. The fact that I was hemorrhaging did not seem to break this oblivious state. My husband had seen the blood-soaked mattress and rushed me to the emergency room instead of the birthing clinic. Nothing natural was on the table, and an emergency cesarean was the new order. The doctor I had been seeing was a family practitioner. I found out later he had had his license revoked and was only licensed to perform prenatal consults. He had lied to me and had never planned on delivering my baby. The hospital called in an OBGYN to perform the cesarean. I told him to perform sterilization since surgery was now the plan. The inner wisdom that I had was guiding me, and when I know, I make decisions quickly. I willingly fell asleep with the aid of anesthesia. When I was barely coherent from my anesthetic coma, my husband leaned gently over my side and whispered, "We have another baby boy, honey, but he's very sick. You lost a lot of blood, but it will be okay." Our tiny baby was being rushed to OHSU and only had a 20% chance for survival. In an earlier era, my obituary would have read, "Died in childbirth, leaving her husband and 5 surviving children ages 9 to 2.5. The baby boy only lived minutes after birth." Our son was born with a diaphragmatic hernia, a hole in his diaphragm, allowing his intestines to slip through and were lying in his chest cavity. As a result, he only had 1 lung developed and he couldn't breathe. He stayed in the hospital and I went home to care for the other children. My husband was serving in the High Council at the time. We were living in a downtown urban ward, and I to this day feel as though we were inspired to move there because we were minutes from the hospitals. A struggling ward struggles with compassionate service. There were many members in this downtown Portland ward that were struggling. I was serving as Laurel advisor at the time. One of my Laurels was out of town waiting for the birth of her baby that she donated to LDS Children's Services in Salem, Oregon. Another Laurel was on probation for sleeping with her boyfriend. Another was so happy and yet divulged that she had had to bring any money that she had everywhere that she went to prevent her siblings and her father from stealing it. She came from a dysfunctional family of 10 children with a father who couldn't stay employed, but he blessed the sacrament every week with a Shakespearean-like delivery. I loved these girls and was so grateful for my experience in the Navy that demonstrated that our worth is not valued by an arbitrary set of standards. The bishopric never visited the hospital. The stake presidency didn't seem to be concerned for our family. My husband was made to feel that his calling on the High Council was his priority. He never missed a meeting or a day of work. I remember when I was recuperating in one hospital and my baby was in another, I laid there and listened to the carolers down the hall. Oh, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Being the Christmas season, I thought of Mary. It makes sense that Joseph would have found a midwife to assist in the birth of Mary's first baby. I'm sure she was still frightened and felt alone with these women who were not her mother or her sisters. I was alone. After I came home, I remember one goddess, Becky Workman, who stepped in with priesthood power. She called me up and told me. She didn't ask. She told me that she would be picking up my 2 little ones, 4 and 2, and keeping them every day after I got the others in school. Then I would head to the hospital to be with my new baby. When I met with the doctor before my baby was to be released from the hospital, he asked me where my husband was. I told him he was at work, of course. I had made all the appointments alone and thought this was just standard pre-release meeting. The baby had had an EEG a few days before, and I was there to get the results. I don't like giving you the results of this test without your husband, he said. I'm okay, I said. What did you find? He told me my baby had brain damage and was at a very high risk of having cerebral palsy. I was strong and put on a warrior's face until I returned to my car, and then I screamed at God. And as I drove home, I said, no, I can do anything, but I cannot do cerebral palsy. My only experience with this disability was with a young man in our ward when I was in high school. He was my age, and I had seen him trying to make friends, trying to socialize at the dances. It's the cruelest disability on earth, I thought. A brilliant mind trapped in a body that is bent and prevents intelligible speech, slobbering and uncontrollable movements. You're a spaz, kids would say, and make fun of him. My son has the most severe form of spastic quadriplegia. When we finally brought the baby home, he was smothered in love from his siblings. We tried to carry on and return to a normal life. I wanted to treat him as just our new baby. We're good now, I thought. We're home together and everything will be all right. I returned to church with 6 children and oxygen tanks. As Luna Lindsay Corbin pointed out in her book, Recovering Agency, belief follows behavior. I was undeniably expressing my belief through sacrificial behavior and public commitment. My husband's calling required him to visit other wards, so I was out in the foyer, and I have no idea where the other 5 children were, in the chapel somewhere. An older gentleman came out and walked over to me. I'm not sure why the visual of a tiny baby and oxygen tanks didn't garner sympathy or compassion. Still, instead, he took this as a teaching moment. Oh, come on, he said. You just need to smile. Life can't be that hard. Speaking of old men, we moved to Arizona 3 years ago. Our ward is comprised of snowbirds, retired couples, and a few locals and families with children. My husband was at church with our son. Being very conscious of the comfort of others, he took him out to the foyer, our sacred location, and was listening to the meeting a short distance from the door. A well-dressed, distinguished snowbird gentleman came out and said, "Your son is disturbing the meeting. Could you move a little farther away?" My husband immediately headed out the door to the car. Another man witnessing what had happened rushed out and grabbed my husband in the parking lot. "Please don't leave," he said. "I'm so sorry." Later, the excellent bishop heard of this incident and called me in to apologize. He then had one of the back center pews removed, shortened, and put up a sign that reads, "This pew is for wheelchairs and accompanying families only." I'm not ungrateful for the times my family has won the game of bishopric roulette. I wish it wasn't less than. Going back, when my son was about a year, someone convinced us that 6 children belonged on acreage. We moved to 3 acres near Mount Hood, Oregon. We visited our prospective new ward before we had physically moved. Are you ready? My husband was put in the bishopric before I had unloaded 1 box. The stake president had not released him from his high council, though he knew that we had moved. My husband obediently attended both callings. Ladies and gentlemen, you have here before you the perfect example of toxic patriarchy. The next 5 years were stressful for our marriage. Children in all 3 levels of schooling and being so far away from medical care. The bright spot was finding a young woman in the ward who had just finished nanny training. She stepped in to help me with childcare. So let me add Debbie King to my list of goddesses with the priesthood. For many years, my spidey sense would bristle at various doctrines that I would hear or read. I absorbed my confusion, wrapped it in shame and unworthiness. I was a lazy learner and depended on others to tell me what I was supposed to know and believe. My beautiful gift of intuition, however, continued to make me wonder. Studies have shown that our frontal cortex does not mature until the age of 25. I was in my mid-30s. It was as if I had been slapped and told to snap out of it. Many historical truths are just now being opened for the public to digest. I love Byron Katie's quote. She said, "I am a lover of what is, not because I'm a spiritual person, but because it hurts when I argue with reality," close quote. Here's what is my what is. My youngest child attended the same school as his siblings. He enjoyed his time spent in the school system, and so did I. We took him to cheerleading competitions, baseball games, band concerts, and football games every Friday night. My older children were built-in sitters, so my husband and I enjoyed meeting with friends weekly. Here is also what is. My other children left home and began their adult lives. Many women, as they approach their 50s, start to think of being big. I can't thank Gina Colvin enough for her interview with Lindsay Hansen Park. Gina addressed the accumulated trauma the LDS Church inflicts, including shame. And Lindsay commented about the trauma of not being able to think big. Women are told what their role is. I've often wondered how men would react if they spent their young adult years obtaining education and training to be accountants. Then, kneeling across an altar, they are commanded and told, "You will be a plumber." I began to watch my peers start the second act of their lives. Some went back to school, some returned to a career. Others dug out their art supplies and dusted off a talent they had buried to raise children. A wonderful woman, another goddess in our ward, after her divorce, began a cleaning business. I hired her, and one day she said, "Hey, if you ever need me to watch TJ, I would be honored." She became another earth angel. The drifting smoke from the fire of possibilities began to drift under the doorframe of the room that held me. I enrolled in the design program at the community college and started learning. Sitting in a classroom was heaven. Efforts it took to get out the door and into that classroom were nothing compared to the joy of staring at a blackboard and listening to an expert in the field. We also had a group of 16-year-old young men in our ward that welcomed TJ into their gang. They would often come over and watch him. He thrived in this rare time of peer camaraderie. The mothers of these boys are on my list of goddesses: Sherry, Whitney, and Donna. Let me step to the side again to share how much these boys and Brenda meant to our family. On September 11th of 2011, while sitting in a doctor's office with my son, I received that dreaded and sickening phone call that we all dread. My oldest son blurted out, "Mom, Mike is dead. Kendall is trying to get a hold of you. Mike was killed in a car accident." I was flustered and confused. I apologized to the doctor and called my daughter. She had been walking with her daughter that morning, who was only 20 months old. She was pregnant with their second baby when a police car drove up next to her. They informed her that her young 25-year-old husband had been killed in a car accident that morning on his way to work. He had just graduated from the police academy in Seattle, Washington. What was I going to do? My daughter needed me in Seattle, but here I was with the sole caregiver to my son. I can't care for him right now. She needed me more. So on the way home, I started making phone calls, first to Brenda, then to one of the mothers of these young men that lived in Oregon. We had just moved to Washington State. They weren't in our ward, they were our friends. Between them, we were able to hurriedly fly to Seattle and begin the process of burying our son-in-law and relocating our daughter. Our son was no longer the cute little boy in a doll-sized wheelchair when we moved to Washington State. He was now a man. His loud outbursts are disconcerting, and his twisted, rigid limbs are startling. He is unable to speak, but he shouts, "Hi!" His version of singing is a loud yell that takes his whole body to project. With just a few years before my husband's final retirement date, we had moved across the river to Washington State. It was a financial and a permanent decision, we thought. So we began our life, even though we had spent over 40 years in Oregon, cultivating lifelong friends. Moving this time was a huge change. The new ward only knew TJ. None of our other children lived there. And he missed his time that he had spent in primary, where he was allowed to hang out in the back just to listen to the children sing. His favorite primary song is Janice Cat Perry's "Heavenly Father, Are You Really There? And do you hear and answer every child's prayer?" How ironic. Attending the temple was a chore I completed like the dishes or the laundry. I was told I needed to attend weekly, and I wanted to obey. The temple ritual had always been anything and everything but peaceful and soothing. I resented the portrayal of Eve. She was an enlightened being who understood the complete plan of salvation, yet she had to explain to her mate how it worked. I resented that she was punished for her knowledge and her leadership. Adam was assigned a leadership role, though he was portrayed as an innocent child that had only followed Eve because he was afraid to be left alone. The second article of faith states that men will be punished for their sins and not for Adam's transgressions, and yet here I was bowing my head in shame and covenanting to never speak to God because of something Eve had done. I was confused that Eve's eyes were open and she understood the plan, and yet she was told to be silent and follow the guy who wanted to stroll with animals all day. I hated the socialization that attending the ward temple night encouraged. Gathering with ward or stake members and chatting in the temple seemed inappropriate. I chose to go on my own on different days. I found the solution to absolve my guilt. I became a temple worker. It gave me the freedom to move from various locations and not to sit and listen to a session. When I was assigned to an endowment session, I was there to supervise and to keep an eye out for proper ritual performance. I didn't have to bow my head and agree to anything or anybody. I enjoyed those 4 years, and I loved my coworkers. My dissonance increased, however, when I was taught an ordinance was to be performed absolutely perfect, but then told, don't correct any of the participants. I was uncomfortable seeing behind the curtain. I had to bite my tongue when the temple president harshly chastised me for not seeing a red check on a name card. My jaw dropped when one of the sisters on my shift was able to keep her position, though her husband had been arrested. They served as a couple every Thursday night until he was found guilty and jailed for sexually molesting one of his primary children at church during primary, and she 100% supported him and believed he was innocent. She kept her position every Thursday evening. I was counseled to change my white shoes because there was a tiny silver flower on the toe. The rain of the Pacific Northwest and my husband's desire to play golf inspired our last move. He was now fully retired and ready for his third and final season of life, a season that most retired couples enjoy together. We moved to Arizona, and I sat back and watched him flourish as a desert rose. We moved into a golf community. He formed friendships with men in the neighborhood, and he started to schedule golf days. He was assigned in the Elders Quorum presidency. Please don't get the impression that I do not recognize that I have been so lucky to have a partner that is hardworking, kind, generous, and a follower of Jesus. I am so grateful for this man that I hypnotized into marrying me. What broke my shelf was watching a wonderful man bend to patriarchal and cultural norms that were supposedly commanded from God. I was again at home with a son in his 30s. We attended the Gilbert Temple together for the last time in 2018. As we drove away, I firmly announced that I was done. I would never go back again. After 43 years, I could not listen to the hypocritical evangelical garbage any longer. When the committee changed the narrative in 2019, I went back to check it out. I could see the effort, but not the revelation. It seemed contrived. Thank you, Margaret Toscano, for putting my feelings into words at your address at last year's symposium. I asked my husband what he thought, considering that they had changed the exact things I had been complaining about. He shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. He takes his covenant to never speak ill of the leadership seriously. The misunderstanding of the power of the priesthood has led a few men to ask my husband if he had ever given our son a blessing. Surely he would not be in this state if he had pronounced a priesthood blessing upon him. I'm so proud of my husband for controlling the urge to punch these arrogant men in the face. Once, a beautiful little boy with saucer brown eyes came up to me as I sat in the foyer with my son. He had just been released from his primary class. "Have you ever given TJ a blessing?" he said. I smiled and said, "Yes, of course. I believe he is strong because of this blessing." He looked confused and replied, "I don't believe you," and walked away. The truth didn't ring true to this innocent little mind after a primary lesson that taught him of the miracles of the priesthood power. He hadn't yet been taught the conflicting message of the faith it requires to understand when blessings don't change the outcome. The buildings that I met in Portland and Washington were not wheelchair accessible. They are making improvements now. I've actually seen some handicap placards on pews in a few chapels in various buildings, but it's not consistent. Having seen these placards on pews in some buildings, I asked our bishop at the time if he would install them in our chapel. He ignored my request. One of my goddesses took it upon herself to become guardian of the pew. She would literally stand up and walk over to anyone sitting there and inform them that this was reserved for wheelchairs. Thank you, Aaron, for your priesthood. I also requested from 3 different bishoprics that a specialist be called as directed in the handbook to help me with my son. I was again ignored. A dear sister who struggled with sitting in Relief Society asked if I would mind if she took TJ to primary, where they could both sit in the back and drink in the music. Thank you, Joy. Your name is the perfect description of what you bring to others. Thank you for listening to your inner priesthood power. Most rooms in our buildings don't accommodate wheelchairs. The restrooms don't accommodate wheelchairs in spite of the applied placard. I should have known this since I've only experienced nursing a baby in a closet or a bathroom. To clarify and highlight the perfect example of my experience with patriarchy and misunderstood priesthood, I must share this story. Just last month, my husband went up to the teacher of the priesthood class he had just attended. The lesson was on trials. He thanked the teacher for the lesson and told him he appreciated the work that he had put in. The gentleman touched his shoulder, and with tears in his eyes, he said, I thought of you the entire time I was preparing this lesson. My husband confusedly asked, why? He said, well, I heard about your wife. Not anything about his 35-year-old son in a wheelchair. I needed to go home. I needed to find the Jesus that I knew as a child attending Bible school. I wanted to find the Jesus that loved me, the Jesus that loves me because the Bible told me so. I wanted to click my heels together and go back to know about Jesus, the one who didn't care about what you wore, what you ate, or how many steps you took on a certain day. Quoting Richard Rohr again, he says, early stage religion tends to focus on cleaning up, which is to say, determining who meets the requirements for moral behavior and religious belief. But Jesus threw a wrench into this whole machinery by refusing to enforce or even bother with what he considered secondary issues like the Sabbath, ritual laws, purity codes, membership requirements, dress codes, and on and on. He saw they were only human commandments, which far too often took the place of love, close quote. Dr. DeLynn and other podcasts led me and introduced me to authors that addressed my questioning mind. I have spent the last year reading Barbara Brown Taylor, Rachel Held Evans, Glennon Doyle, Greg Prince, Michael Quinn, Matt Harris, Brene Brown, Richard Rohr, Virginia Woolf, Rian Eisler, Sue Monk Kidd, Elizabeth Lesser, Richard Bushman, Joanna Brooks, Benjamin Park, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Megan Watterson, Fawn Brody, and just for fun, The Witches of New York by Annie McKay. I've listened to every podcast by Lindsay Hansen Park, Lindsay and Brian Buchanan, Gina Colvin, Bill Reel, RFM, and of course, Mormon Stories. I gasped when I read that Joseph Smith used a stone and a hat. I had taught my children to sing Book of Mormon stories and had images of the gold plates on my wall. In the car, we sang, I'm a Mormon, yes I am. If you want to study a Mormon, I'm a living specimen. I thought polygamy was for widows, not young girls transplanted from far away, and women who sat alone while their husbands were sent on missions. The Relief Society only operated for 2 years, and then because of polygamy, how did Doctrine and Covenants 132 come to be? You have heard all of these questions, and I have been lied to, and have spent my life pledging allegiance to a corporation, and the curtain has been pulled back on the wizard. I am no longer a lazy learner, I am a hungry learner. Frank Baum once said, illusion is a reality that hasn't occurred yet. I am no longer interested in false reality and illusions. I listened to a TED Talk by Dawn Smith. She grew up in a cult which was started by her father and grandfather. When she was finally able to break free, she said, quote, I could not be in a group where women and children were sacrificed so that a few men could stay in charge. She continued, staunch loyalty to any group is wrong if it means supporting an abusive, narcissistic, pathological liar. It trickles down to the group, close quote. And the last thing she said was, "It takes a lot of work to unlearn behavior." Today, my husband goes to church and sits alone. I connect to the Zoom church for my son. He and I are still sitting alone, but we're in our home, and I can busy myself while he listens to the hymns and the prayers that he has grown up with and that he loves. I am fortunate to have a partner that loves me more than his religion. He always has, but he doesn't know how to accept this new darkness. I told him that I had partaken of the fruit and that my eyes were opened and that I would be cast out of this corporation. He is a true believer, but he has accepted that I am my own person and is suffering through my willingness to find joy in the darkness. I'd like to end by another wonderful quote from one of my women heroes. Quote, "Even when light fades and darkness falls, as it does every single day, in every single life, God does not turn the world over to some other deity. Here is the testimony of faith. Darkness is not dark to God. The night is as bright as the day." Close quote. Barbara Brown Taylor. The last time I attended church, I sat behind a young mother. She was sitting alone with her 3 young babies. Her husband was sitting on the stand, a young man between 2 older. At one point, another woman got up and sat next to her, taking her baby so she could wrangle her 2-year-old. Another example of comparing the power of God versus perceived visual power. I shook my head and knew I needed to go home to find Jesus. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. Thank you so much.